Hey everybody, it's Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. For all things Vespa, check us out at ScooterWest.com. If you're looking for parts to restore a vintage Vespa like this P200 right here, check us out. We got you covered. For a scooter like this, we have nearly every part, with the exception of stuff like a frame, but you can build a motor from parts. So on to the subject of this video. This is going to be part 3 of the restoration and getting this super original P200 back in good working order and roadworthy condition. Part 1 was an intro to the scooter. I kind of went around the P200 if you're not familiar with the P200 and kind of talked about what I need to do to get a scooter that's been sitting for several years with very low miles back on the road. Part 2, we did the engine overhaul with the motor that was still in the frame. If you look at videos from the past, I've done complete engine overhauls for a P200E, which is essentially the same motor as, the Vespa's, 1959 all the way up to the last P200s in 2016. There's not that many changes. You're pretty much covered with that video, along with an addendum where I rebuilt a VBB motor. Kind of shows some of the differences with the motors from the 60s and early mid-70s. Starting in 77 is when they came out with this style motor. This is a 78 P200. It was also found in the very last Rally 200s. On to the subject of this video, we're going to fix all the electrical issues on it, starting with the kill switch wiring that's completely rotted away. The rest of the wiring is in great condition, but oftentimes you'll have problems where the bike will stall out an old P200 and will still have this original wire that's just deteriorating. If that gets moisture on it, usually will stall the scooter out. All the other wires, they just have regular vinyl insulation and they're in great condition still. If your harness is in really poor condition, that's where it's maybe worth replacing it, or if you're doing a full restoration, maybe ideal to replace it. But this scooter's so original, I'd rather use the original harness that's in the scooter. We're also going to go through the ignition system. That includes replacing all these wires that are just starting to deteriorate on the stator plate. This actually is in pretty remarkable condition considering the age, but usually scooters that have much higher miles, all the wires will start to deteriorate like this. The insulation will crack away. To realize this is exposed to higher temperatures and oil and gas from the engine, so it deteriorates the insulation on the wiring. The stator itself, I don't suspect any issues with the coils, even though those coils are replaceable. This is the pickup coil for the ignition system, so it triggers the spark for electronic ignition. This is a low tension coil. It generates the anywhere from 70 to 200 volts for the ignition system. The rest of the coils, they're a combination of lighting coils, and these pair are the charging coils, so they'll charge the battery. And while I'm going over getting the scooter going, I'll go over what runs off the battery, what doesn't run off the battery, because there's a lot of confusion. Do you need a battery for the ignition to work? And then the answer right there is no, but they pretty much have 3 separate electrical systems on these scooters. Stuff that's powered by the battery, the self-powered ignition system, and the AC powered headlight. It's typically a headlight. Some scooters, everything's powered by the magneto, for instance, so it only comes on when the scooter's running, and I'll go over that. Another thing we're going to replace, this is the original Ducati CDI box. It probably still does work, and I'll probably just keep this box with the scooter because it's kind of like the original thing. But if I'm going to use the scooter on the road, it's not worth using something this old. The condensers and capacitors are aged quite a bit inside, and that's typically what fails. The semiconductors that are in, epoxy potted into this system, or into this box, usually hold up pretty well, but there's parts inside that start deteriorating, and not worth trusting it, because sure enough, you'll go on a long ride, it will heat up, and that's when it will fail. Same with the wire, it's kind of getting hard and stiff. This cap, who knows if this will short out and cause a problem. We'll replace all these parts, pretty inexpensive. And when starting a job like this, I kind of have an idea of the parts I would need. Let me go over all the new parts that I've pulled out that I'm probably going to use for this scooter here. So you're going to need to start with a brand new battery. If it's got an ancient battery in there that's got 0 or 2 volts in it, probably not going to recover it. Battery's pretty inexpensive. Typical life of a battery like this is 3 to 5 years. Sometimes I've seen a little bit longer. As long as they're always kept to a full charge, they tend to last a lot longer. If you deplete the battery or you don't use the scooter for 6 months, there's a chance the battery may not recover. So that's something that's expendable. It's a lead acid battery with vents on it. You could put a sealed battery in there. There is enough room. This is the original size battery for the 70s American market P200s and P125X. You know, it's a 12N 5.5-3B. 2 terminals. Oftentimes the terminal's a little larger than original battery. It's got a vent on there. It's enough about the battery, but typically you need to have a battery. Oftentimes the battery strap, that's the rubber strap that holds the battery, is rotted. So part number 090854. We always have that. It's a popular part that people need to buy. For the ignition system, part number on this is SPARKWIRE. It's the high voltage wire. Pretty inexpensive part. Sometimes you'll see the insulation starting to get rubbed through. It's very flexible and in good condition compared to the original. I'm going to replace the ignition box. This is the original Ducati ignition box. The only difference is they are now in blue versus black, but functionally it's identical. These ones that have the larger size coil on them tend to make a little bit stronger spark than those original style ones. Definitely want to have that. There's also, we sell the rubber grommets. The rubber grommets are in pretty good shape. But just keep that in mind. If the rubber grommets that go over to SPARKWIRE are rotted, you may need to get those. To replace that original Bosch spark plug cap, the most reliable and robust cap that we found is just the basic NGK spark plug cap. It's got the regular threaded terminal. Comes with a rubber bushing for both the plug, keeps the moisture out of the plug, and also for the spark wire. Very inexpensive. Part number on this is SPARKCAP. And moving on to the parts that you need to replace the stator wiring. So the wiring on the stator is, you know, it's a special type of high temperature wire that can handle the temperatures that are found in the motor, not just the regular vinyl insulation wire that you find at, you know, a home improvement store or, for instance, you know, auto parts stores. Just not very ideal wire. So we have a couple different options for the wiring because they have essentially 3 different stators for the P125 and the P200E. So the first one, if you have an early, you know, 78 or 79 P125X that has points, it's going to have 2 yellow wires coming from the stator. Also includes the wire to the coil, and that's SWK-1. If you have the later P125X that has the, a red wire and a yellow wire coming off the stator, that's going to be part number SWK-2. If you have an early P200 with electronic ignition, such as this one, so it's 1978, 79, SWK-3, this is the one we're going to use to overhaul the stator that's on this scooter. And if you're running a later P200, you know, pretty much the after VIN number 34627, pretty much 1980 and 81, SWK4. And they have a red wire and a yellow wire. Actually, there's 2 red wires because one of them is for the ignition, so it's kind of a little redundant, but different style terminals. So we're going to use that to overhaul the stator. Unfortunately, I can't find the ignition key, so I'm going to replace the ignition switch. So if you have the early P200, 1977, 1979, it's they call it the 4-pole ignition switch. And if you have the later one, it's going to be a 3-position switch, and it's got 8 terminals on it. So you can see it's a real simple switch operation. See how it makes the contact. So when you have the scooter into on position, it shunts these two, and that turns the power on from the battery to the tail light and such. And when you turn it off, it shorts these two smaller terminals. And what that does is it shorts out the ignition system, and that's what shuts the ignition down, so you no longer have spark. So that's how this key switch works. So key comes out. So we'll put a new spark plug. I always recommend NGK. If you have a 200, the original spark plug is a B7ES, is kind of the ideal plug for a stock 200. 125, I'd recommend a B7HS, so it's a short reach plug. It has a shorter set of threads on it. Typically these are gapped appropriately for a Vespa out of the box, as long as the box hasn't been dropped or knocked around. So the original fuse holder that protects everything that's powered by the battery uses this European style 8 amp fuse. These fuse holders oftentimes are pretty heavily corroded from the years of being exposed to the elements, but we do have the replacement fuse. I think the part number on this is fuse 8 if you have the original fuse holder. If you need a new fuse holder, what I recommend is we sell this complete assembly that has a high quality fuse holder that pretty much fits in the original position, has the correct terminals on it, and a nice thick 14 gauge wire. Part number on this is 142519-IA. I suspect I won't need this part for this scooter. The original fuse holder will be in good condition, but I'll have a fuse on hand just in case it's blowing or I accidentally make a short and blow the fuse. Oftentimes, the original flasher for the turn signals just no longer works. They use a three-prong flasher, part number 164356, and oftentimes you just got to replace the flasher. It's the standard, they call it a thermal flasher. 3 terminals on there, pretty inexpensive. Just good to have it. If it's still got the original flasher, it's likely not going to work anymore, is what I've found. And the last part, hopefully I don't need it. Typically the voltage regulators are pretty reliable. So if you have the early 79, 78 P200 P125X, it's going to use the double yellow wiring harness. So essentially it's a pair of wires that come from the coils on the stator. We have a replacement regulator rectifier that we fabricate in-house with a much higher quality modern voltage regulator. It's got a pair of yellow wires and a pair that come out. Baja Designs is a San Diego company here that does a lot of electrical for motorcycles, and this happens to be the perfect regulator to replace the original Ducati regulator if it's failed in your scooter. We have this available for the early bikes, early scooters, 218060, and this is only for the early scooters. Works better than the original one. There's a little potentiometer if you want to adjust the voltage, not really needed. It's set out of the box, and the little paper instructions. Probably won't need that. I suspect the voltage regulator is going to be working just fine on this scooter, but if we do need to replace the regulator or rectifier regulator, we certainly have one. And same with the later bikes, is a different part number for the voltage regulator. It has different functions on how it works, different terminal arrangement. Put that part number in the description. So we know the kill switch, the ignition wire, is just rotted away inside the harness. So I have about 20 feet of good cross-link polyethylene insulated wire. It's not just the cheap vinyl insulation wire. I have heat shrink tubing and also vinyl tubing to protect the wiring where it passes through the handlebars and also where it's near the engine. I have various terminals. I have trays and trays of different terminals. These are called quick connects. There's a 1/4 inch style. There's a 3/16 inch style. I have some ring terminals. I don't know what you need if you're doing something like this at home, but here at my workshop, I have all that stuff on hand, ready to go to make the wiring repairs I need to. All right, now for the fun part. Let's get on to doing the repairs on this scooter. I'm going to start with the most common repair that most people do, and that's replacing the wiring on the stator. You're going to need to have some experience with a soldering iron, and hopefully a higher quality soldering iron. You could do it with a cheap one, but high quality soldering irons that are temperature regulated tend to work a lot better, and you're set up for success. You're not going to overheat the terminals. So let's get over to the station where I'm going to solder up the new wiring on this and replace all this wiring and make this thing look perfect and new. And I'll also bring my own meter along with me, and we'll go ahead and check all the coils, because the last thing we want to do is rewire it and find out there's a coil that's got an open circuit. So here I got my soldering iron. You can see it's got a very fat tip. This is a really nice Hakko soldering iron. Tends to work really good. I got several of these in the workshop in different departments of the business. We do a lot of soldering of different stuff. It's got the sponge to clean the tip. I'm sure you can find lots of really good tutorial videos on how to solder. I would certainly not try to practice on a stator plate as your first project to solder. It's much like welding. There's some technique to it. I would just suggest watching the details and what I do when I'm soldering it. I have the temperature set to 775 degrees Fahrenheit. It's kind of a higher temperature versus electronic soldering. All these, none of the terminals are touching each other right now. And I'm gonna check continuity on all these coils, and I'll talk about all the different ones. So hopefully the camera can get the meter in here. So it's in ohms, so this is the omega symbol. This is an auto range meter, so if I short this, it's nearly 0 ohms, so 0.1, 0.3 ohms, very low. It's just the resistance of the wire, essentially. But the first one we're gonna check is, you're gonna put one probe on the base plate of the stator, and then there's this black wire right here. And so you gotta dig through the lead a little bit. And it shows 0.1 ohms, which is essentially 0. There's continuity. So that's the way you should see that. So we know that the ground terminal here is good. There's another ground terminal right under here that's covered with some varnish. And you can see how I'm breaking through the insulation. It's a white wire underneath that insulation, but if you break through, it also will be 0 ohms. So that's the white wire and the black wire. And that brings the ground both to the ignition system and to the regulator. This is your ignition pickup, and you can see they put some type of varnish on there, and with the sharp terminal usually you can break through it. And typically this should be about 110 ohms, and you can give it about 20% range. So, you know, it could be 130 ohms is probably okay. It could be just under 100 ohms and you'd be okay. But this is typical. I suspect this pickup will work just fine. Moving on to the low tension coil. Typically this is around 500 ohms. And again, I'm gonna need to break through this paint that they put on there. You can see there's no continuity, but if you break through it, you should be able to get continuity. 520 ohms, and that's fine. And it's got the green wire that goes to it. Moving on to the lighting coils. So it's got a purple wire, and oftentimes this wire may look brown. I've seen people replace them with the brown wire because they never knew that that was a purple wire. So off this terminal, you should be very low, you know, under 2 ohms, but it shouldn't be 0. And you can see the wire goes around the coil. It jumps over to this next coil, and then it comes back around and grounds right there. So that's the way this coil. The next set of coils are the charging coils for the battery. And you can see they both have yellow wires, or if you're dealing with the later stator, one's gonna be a yellow and there's gonna be a red wire. Well, I wanna check for continuity against ground. There shouldn't be any. So it should just stay OL, or open circuit, or very, very high ohms. Sometimes you might see mega ohms, which means there's a little bit of moisture in the coils. That's why it's fluctuating just a little bit. Next, we'll check the resistance, you know, the yellow wire to the yellow wire. And again, they have a varnish on this. I need to scratch through. 1.0 ohms, that's about right. So I would say anywhere from 0.8 ohms to 2 ohms is typically what a meter would read. There's some tolerance between different meters when you're doing that. So the first step I'm gonna do is desolder all the wires. You're gonna need to make sure there's none of this paint stuff that they put on these originally. I don't know why they do this, because the later stators from the later era, they never do this. And you just take a knife and you can scrape it off. The soldering iron will melt through that eventually, but it's just gonna make the job easier if you just scrape it off. So only a couple of the terminals have that paint or varnish on it. And next we'll go ahead and desolder the wires. You gotta be careful with the soldering iron. Obviously it's high temperature. I'm gonna start with the yellow wire. The wires kind of route all around here. So this is the furthest wire that's away. I'll see if I could keep my hands out of the way. You grab this with the needle nose, ideally something a little smaller. It's just this is what I had. I know there's kind of a shadow right here with the light. But I'm going to take my soldering iron, and typically you can melt right through it and pull the wire right out. Another trick, maybe I'll show you on one of the other terminals if I'm having any difficulty. Say you can't get the terminal hot enough, you may want to add a little bit of solder. You don't want to put too much temperature in these because the windings are, they're made out of plastic. These things are plastic, so the soldering iron will melt that. See how it will melt a little bit? And if you put too much temperature in that, you will melt the little eyelet that's in there, and it makes a mess of the whole entire stator. So I'm trying to keep the stator in perfect shape. Another way to pull the wire away is just carefully, see how I'm going to use the pressure of the stator. You can wet the tip of the soldering iron and clean the tip. See how clean, shiny that is. You can see it shines. But if you add a little solder to the tip, or even what you're trying to desolder, you know, the solder actually will help conduct the heat right through it. See how it pulled right out really nicely, and the eyelets in there just perfect. So no problems there. And then two more. This one's a little more difficult because it's buried in the in between the two coils. You could use a knife or a small screwdriver to kind of pull the wire away as you heat it up. Again, kind of right behind there. See how it pulled right out? And now the wire's separated from the terminal. And after this, we'll do the two grounds. Get the soldering iron a little wet with solder. And see, once I added solder to it, it conducts the heat right through the terminal very easily and melts the solder. All right, next, you got this white wire that's a ground. It's kind of got this varnish all over it. I'll kind of loosen it up. See if we can get the soldering iron in here, and I'm just gonna go ahead and get a knife or a screwdriver under here. One thing about desoldering these ground terminals, this metal sucks a ton of heat, so you need to have a good soldering iron to do this, to get enough heat soaked in there, and you lift it right away. I don't want to lift those other wires. Those are the ground wires for your the stator itself. So I kind of underneath that black ground wire, and I'll heat up the terminal and lift it. So now all the wires have been lifted away from each one of the terminals. I kind of remember where they all go. You could mark them all if you wanted to. You know, you can see the white wire kind of goes over here. White and a red wire come through this hole right there. So it's just that hole. I see people rewire these all the time, and they just do a Mickey Mouse job. I like when they're done the original way because it works pretty good. Next, you want to take each of the wires, and you could pull them around. Start with the longest, the furthest yellow wire. I'm going to pull it all the way to the hole that it goes through. And fortunately, these are still in pretty good shape. Most stators I take apart, the wire is just completely crumbling. But I can tell you, if we put this scooter back in service, these wires probably wouldn't last too long. So white wire, and the last wire that's the hardest one to get out is this black wire. And we'll see if we can pull that out. So pull these wires all out. Oftentimes where the wires fail is they short against the aluminum plate. Let's see if we can find any damage to the wires. That wire looks good. That one's starting to deteriorate. Well, that's the ground wire, but see how it's completely damaged? And people are like, oh, well, it cuts out every once in a while. It's starting to cut out. Well, it's the wires shorting against the plate, or it's no longer charging, the headlights flickering. It's these wires deteriorating and shorting right here. So, like I said, this wire is a little difficult. You may be able to exercise it through. Sometimes I've just had to leave them behind, unfortunately, because can't get it out. But another way to do it is just get the insulation off the wire. See how it's just crumbling? And once you get the insulation out of there, well, you can carefully pull it right through. So there you go. So got all the wires out. Your white and red go through that, rest of the colors go through that hole. And if you need to, you know, take a Sharpie and mark them. So, but there's my existing wiring diagram. Of course, you could build something like this yourself, but if you don't have the high quality polyethylene cross-link polyethylene wire, you can certainly buy one of our kits that has all this stuff ready to go. So these wires that are in our kit are a little bit longer than you need to be, and I like to make them exactly, because they've wired the stators a little different every time. They're very close, so you can see the white wire, it's maybe a ½ inch too long. So you just take some diagonal pliers. You can leave them a little longer, but you don't want to leave them too much longer. And just go through each one of these wires. I know it's a little tedious, but you're gonna end up with better results. That wire is just about right. This is the red wire down here. Leave that one alone. The green wire. Somewhere about there. You can see that one's about 1 inch too long. So cut that somewhere like such. There's going to be 2 yellow wires. So the one that's longer, we'll see if, let me pull the terminal back so you can see the terminals are, something about like right there. That would be acceptable, but once you strip it, maybe it's about that length, and then you got the second yellow wire right there. Just a little bit shorter because it goes to the coil that's closer to the thing. I know it's like kind of a lot of work to do all this, but if you want to have a professional job, you want to get all this done, not do a sloppy job, and I'm kind of showing you the way to do a nice professional job where it matches the original stuff just perfectly. And the last 2 wires, you got the purple, it's your headlight wire. Pull that through, probably, sometimes that one's a little longer than the rest, somewhere about there. And very, very close. Maybe needs just a 1/8 inch nipped off it, or 3/8 I meant. And the last one, the black, sometimes I'll leave the black a little bit longer. The black one's, it's about perfect. I'm just gonna leave that alone. So we know that's all perfect. You keep that as a template if you need. Take a set of high quality strippers, just some simple ones like that, and I'm stripping maybe 3/16 of an inch from each one of these wires. So I want to prepare all the wires. Tons of different wire strippers out there. The idea is you don't want to nick the wire. It's just pulling the insulation away. It's not actually touching the copper. And that's pretty important for a good quality set of wire strippers. And then I'll give them all a little twist so they're all tight. And then we'll go through and tin the wires. So if you watch soldering videos, I think some of those electronic videos, they show how to tin the wires. And it's an old practice. Well, solder is mostly tin and lead, but it pretty much puts something so it makes them rigid, because you try to shove those through those eyelets, it's going to be really difficult. So see how I'm just wicking the solder, a little bit of solder right there. I'm not puddling on where there's a bead of solder on there. I'm just getting it soaked into the copper. And so you don't see the copper, you just see kind of that lead tin coat. So, and by the way, if this is something you don't want to tackle, we have, I don't know, probably every year we do like over 100 stators. People mail them. If you look on our website, we have the service for doing a mail order stators, and it's a very popular service. A lot of people send their stuff to us, and I kind of see why. It just, maybe you're not familiar with it, doing soldering and that kind of stuff, and you just want us to do it professionally. So the hard one, we'll start with the hard one. We'll try to feed this black wire up. Sometimes you don't have success. You could try to clean out this channel that the wire goes up. The other option is just go around everything, but looks like we'll be fine. So this black wire I'm just going to start with the most difficult one, and it's going to go onto that terminal right there behind this coil. So Ideally, you want to add a little bit of fresh new solder and it's rosin core electronic solder. So the rosin is the actual flux. You could use flux if you wanted to, but not really needed. And it gets a little warm. I use my finger in there, but I'm holding it at the insulation. That's a nice strong solder joint on there, so that's good. Hardest one's already done. So, and we'll just move through each of the colors. Right now, purple is going to be our next wire color, and you could pull more slack than you need for right now. Purple is going to go in this one right here. Again, little solder on the tip. You could feed solder in there, but there's already some solder on there. I'm going to go from the back side and heat the eyelet up and feed the wire right through. And that's all you need to do. You don't need to do anything. Sometimes if you have a little bit of a tail back there, you want to trim it. And look at that. It looks just like it did from the original. It's perfect. So that's kind of the way you do it. Then you could pull the wire right in there. So next are not the shortest yellow, but the shorter of the two yellows. We'll go ahead and pull that all the way around. Go in that eyelet. Let it cool. And if you pull the wire, sometimes you'll be too quick on the job and you'll pull the wire right out. We'll have a cold solder joint, which is not a desirable thing. So, and the last yellow wire, feed that up. And see, I'm just pulling it around all the coils there. So it just tucks in that little area that's underneath the coil. And you got to realize all this stuff is exposed to pretty high temperatures, probably 250 degrees, as high as that kind of temperature is underneath here. So that's why you got to use the special wire. That's why the original wire is deteriorated so much. So, all right, now we just give all the wires. I'm going to start with the yellow wires, and we can tug them so they're all tight. See how I'm just giving that a pretty tight pull? You want to pull them pretty tight. They're pretty resilient. Pull the purple, and now we're to the point where we can get the wires all through. Now we'll hook up the ignition wires. The green wire goes right through here. And sometimes I've seen the green wire actually come through this one. Just depends on what who assembled it from the factory. I think either way is fine. So this is a little harder because they got that paint on there. So I'm going to heat up the eyelet as quick as I can. Just don't want to dwell on it. See how it pulled the wire a little bit? I tucked the wire back in there. So yeah, you saw it pulled the wire away. So you want to make sure that wire that comes off the coil is also soldered with that wire there. And now the last two. So you got the yellow and the red. Pull the slack out of these. Pretty self-explanatory for these two. So do the white first. Not yellow and red. I said we're going to do the white and red. So this ground terminal that's closer to this pickup coil, I'm going to put a little more solder onto it. Just feed it in there and give it a little blow. Cools off the solder. It cools off on its own really quick. Pull that one down and the pickup coil. And sometimes this one's a little harder to feed through. There we go. And if you don't like the tail again, just take some diagonal cutters, the little wire, and look at that, it's perfect. And if you really want to put the paint on there, you could probably find some nail polish that would do the same thing, some type of lacquer nail polish. But like I said, it's not really necessary. The wires get pulled like that and pull the slack out. See how the red's got a little bit of slack. So pull all the slack out. And you see how that goes. Put a zip tie that's included in the wire kit. And if you want to double check your work, you can ohm out all the wires just like I did in the first step, testing my coils. You could certainly do that if you want to. I'd pull the zip tie as tight as you can because that's kind of what crimps down on the wires. And voila, there you go. It's a perfectly wired stator, ready to go back into the scooter. No problems there. Should work perfect with no issues. And this wiring should give another 50 years of service, no problem. So now we know our stator's all in perfect shape and ready to go. Everything ohms out good. We're gonna go ahead and install it. So there's the 3 wires that are for the ignition. They feed up through this little hole. It's a little bit of a tight fit, but you can get them all through there. And it's kind of nice that the terminals are all a little staggered. And you just gotta feed them through, you know, one by one. Help them along. So, and maybe the last one's being stubborn, you could just, I'll send that one through and get that in there. All right, so feed that through. And I have the Woodruff key is in the perfect shape. It looks perfect. The crank's in really nice shape. No issues there. And this is the direction. It is possible to install the stator. The wires won't really they won't reach in any other position, but right there is kind of where you want it. You can see there's a slot, you know, on the thing. Is what I'm gonna do is set it right to where it was originally. And I replaced the one screw that I did strip a little bit when I took it out. And you get it started. I'm kind of holding the stator here. Get a Phillips driver, just something to start it. And if I was building a high performance motor, I would time the engine, mark the flywheel so I could get real accurate timing marks that are, you know, within 1 degree, but we're talking a stock motor, no issues here. And when I took it apart, I showed that there's a wave washer and a flat washer, same arrangement, so screw, wave washer, then flat washer. So I got all 3 in there. Wires aren't pinched. They're all passing through that junction right there. And we're good. All right, so Woodruff key's in place. I kind of have it to 12 o'clock position. Make sure your flywheel's really clean inside. Looks perfect in this thing. This thing is nice. It's never even, no rust, no problems at all. I already know the magnets are really strong on it. If there is an issue, you can hang the wrench off it. I mean, this thing is just nice and strong. You know, every single magnet strong. We do have a magnetizer here at our shop, like it's a vintage old tool. Pretty cool setup, but you can mail your flywheel to us and we can remagnetize it for you. And the way I put these on is I get direct where I could sight the slot that's in the that's machined in the crank, and then you can see the Woodruff key, because it's very easy to push the Woodruff key out of its slot. And if you look down it, you can sight it and get it on there perfect, no problem. So always replace this washer. 012555 is this washer. They get pretty crushed when you tighten the nut. And the last thing you don't want that flywheel nut coming off. It ends up just tearing up the crankshaft, or it can break the flywheel, or more dangerous, the flywheel can go rolling down the road. So if you have a torque wrench, about 45 foot-pounds is where you want to set it. So right now I'm just holding it. You can use the original flywheel puller that would hook around the Kickstarter, and it would go into this hole, but newer flywheels, they don't have that kind of stuff. So I already got the nut pretty tight. I use like a screwdriver. I don't care about all that much. And go between the, the Kickstarter, something like that. And I always like to use the screwdriver very carefully placed there where it puts a pressure on the edge. It's very easy to break these fins, but with these hard plastic screwdrivers, that's safe on torque and everything. So we know it's good. And you're gonna want to, you'll feel the washer kind of collapse quite a bit. 30 foot-pounds. 45, there we go. So we're all good there. I haven't put the cap in. You can buy this as a replacement part. It's not necessary, but keeps the threads perfect in that thing. You can get the junction box in there. See, this little junction box has got a hole where the wires pass, and there's where the screw goes to close up the junction box. It's a replaceable part. Sometimes they'll break just because they're plastic and old. So you get all the wires through, and the little plastic thing just snaps in there. So you got the new setup. You need a wire that's around 20.5 inches. So it should be good. They're pre-measured, the ones we sell. I'm gonna put a little bit of dielectric grease. One thing is somebody at our shop didn't cut this square. If you bought this from our web store, I would give you permission to return this wire because it should be cut square. I have to talk to whoever did the bulk cutting on this. Just joking, but so you have some dielectric grease. It helps, you know, helps. Ooh, that thing is set a little high, but that's more than enough to do the whole entire job. So we'll put that on the lead. You could put a small amount inside the boot. And the way these work is you thread the wire in there, and it's got like a, kind of looks like a wood screw. And you just keep on twisting the cap on there. And now it's really tight because it just threaded right on there. So now we're gonna take the boot that's that goes on the CDI box. It's pretty important you have this boot. I see a lot of people that'll assemble it without this boot. This boot is the original one. It's in really nice shape, so I'm gonna reuse it. You could definitely buy a replacement rubber bit, or you could buy a whole rubber kit that has pretty much all the rubber bits for a vintage Vespa. If the scooter's been out in the elements, you may just, you know, all the rubber bits are probably rotted. This thing's had a nice indoor storage. But just like the spark cap, you just thread the CDI box onto the wire. So it takes quite a few turns. Doesn't really get much tighter because eventually it just kind of strips or whatever. It slips, something like that. So, and give it a tug. You gotta make sure that's tight. Last of your dielectric grease, you could just put it in these terminals. I've used these scooters in really inclement weather, or when I've done an off-road race. I packed all this stuff with that dielectric grease, and it's like magic. It keeps the water out of the terminals. Won't cause any problems. Again, I'm gonna test it. So, white Bianco, and I got red Rosso, and green Verde. So let's give it a test. So let's verify spark. I could kick it over and look for spark. Of course, I have really bright lights here in the service department. You can see it's got a nice bright spark, so no problems there. We know we have ignition. So go ahead and put the CDI back onto the bracket with a pair of flat screws. They got flat washer, a split washer. Pretty self-explanatory. You know, just pretty much line up the screws. And I'm just getting them hand started. And you'll need a pretty large size flat bladed screwdriver, get them tightened on there. So time to put the fan cover on. You can see it's never scraped in there. There's a little bit of grease. I'll wipe all that out just to kind of clean it up in there. Doesn't hurt anything. You know, it kind of actually preserves the metal. So, you know, I could go to town and really clean it up, but not really needed. Kind of adds to the originalness of this motor. Go ahead and lift the plastic fan cover, and we'll get that underneath. And I typically like to start with the top screw, which is a short screw. There's no washer or anything. I'll just get it hand tight and work my way around. Don't want to tighten all these at first because you want to make sure that the fan blades aren't touching the thing. See how there's a little bit of give? You can move it around. Especially if you have an aftermarket fan cover, you could have a problem where it rubs on the surface. Next, there's this little bracket here. I have the ground terminal on the new CDI box. Get that all lined up, and we'll get that one started. You may not want to put this on if you need to make adjustments to the shift cables. I already put fresh grease on here. It's all working good. No need to make any adjustments. Worst case, I do have to take it off. The wires are all tucked in there pretty good. Nice original cables. No issues right there. So that goes in front. And next, we'll take the longer cheese head screw and get it started. So it's a longer one here. The one that's at 9 o'clock and whatever you call 11 o'clock, they're a little shorter. And sometimes this one's just a little hard to get started because it's going through the fan cover. That's exactly why you don't want to tighten everything. Got to get it all lined up. So. And the last but not least, we got the pair that hold the fan cover on. So this one's got a washer on it. Doesn't have an aftermarket. A lot of aftermarket exhaust pipes use this screw as one of the spring mounting points. Not an issue here. And I'll pull that forward. It's me a little grub screw with a big washer for this guy. And then the super crazy big flat screw we'll put in the front. And sometimes you gotta like sight this one to get it just lined up with the hole. It just needs to shift down a little bit or loosen the two screws. So a lot of the wiring on these scooters is located underneath this handlebar cover, the headset top. So you have 4 screws located from underneath the cover that hold the headset cover on. Oftentimes you'll find 1, 2, or 3 or all of them missing. I see on older P200s. This one, they're all still there. They're original screws. And we'll take the last one off on the front. You kind of want to shift the whole steering over so you can get access to the thing. The reason I'm taking this off is because the green ignition wire that's rotting is underneath this cover. We need to replace the ignition switch, unfortunately, even though it's in great shape. But you can see it's pretty loose right now. And you would reach down, and this is your speedometer cable, the kind of thicker of the 2 cables right here. And it's what you want to do is push this cable up as you're lifting the cover. So I'm pushing the cable up through the fork. It goes through the fork tube. I don't have a battery in the scooter because there is some electricity that you could short the terminals. And then I'm reaching directly underneath the speedometer in the center. It's got a knurled nut that you just unthread from the speedometer because you're not gonna be able to get this much further away. And now you can lift this right away from the cover. And it looks great under here. It's all original. Just want to be careful when you're hanging it from this thing, you know, from the thing. And check out this green wire. It is a crumbled mess. The thing is just all through the whole entire wiring. It's going to be crumbling just like that. And this wire will fail. So this is going to be the wire we're going to need to replace. The rest of the wires look good. We're also going to replace the switch. So I'll go ahead and disconnect all the other wires. Cool thing, if you have the later P200s, they do have a little ID that shows you the positions of it. And with the headset cover, this is a nice original one with the exception of a couple scratches up here. You know, all these brass nuts have all been, they're in there still. A lot of times those break off, especially if you over tighten the nuts. Everything else looks really good. It's just the problem, it's also really stiff. So before I put this all together, we're going to go ahead and lubricate everything. A small Phillips screw just holds this Piaggio badge on. We do have these badges available. This one's still in very nice shape, so I'm going to leave it alone. You have a pair of screws. Here and right here. And then moving on to inside the glove box, there's another pair of screws, and that's what holds the lower section of the the horn cover in place. And as with this tray, you know, the glove box inner tray happens to work very well as a little storage spot for the hardware. And those are the correct screws, no problems there. And now we can carefully pull the horn cover away. And then the two clips. You know, the two wires, it's a pink and a white wire. There's no polarity, so they can go on either terminal. Located underneath this junction box, this is the wiring from both the left and right switches terminate into this junction box and then go into your main harness. You just pull those away and carefully lift that up, and it reveals the wiring. And as you can see, it's got the crusty green wire in there that we're going to need to do something about. Fortunately, the handlebar switch has a good green wire. So sometimes the handlebar switches, they'll have a bad green wire. This is a better quality insulation, a vinyl insulation that isn't rotting like this original silicone insulation. So no problems there. So we'll just leave that alone. I don't need to pull the switch out and replace that, which is a good thing. But this wire is all rotted, and it's got a pair of wires. One goes through the main harness, it comes up at the switch. The other one goes all the way back to where the engine is. So all the other wires in this harness, I'm pretty certain they're going to be good, and we're not going to have any wiring problems. We may have some ground problems, but we'll visit that once we put a battery in the scooter, test the DC circuits. You know, the headlight runs off the AC circuit, so we'll have to wait till we get the motor running. But I'm gonna just cut these out. No longer need it. Doesn't hurt anything having the old rotted wire in there. We'll get that out of the way. And then same with up here. We're gonna just go ahead and cut this rotted green wire out of the circuit here. So I'm gonna run a new green wire. I have quite a length here. And also I have some vinyl tubing. This is a semi-rigid vinyl tubing. It's not heat shrink. Heat shrink is a lot thinner and it collapses a lot easier. This will protect the wiring as it passes through the handlebars, because when you move the steering, that's what tends to wear out the wiring. So the first part of the wiring that wears out on these Vespas is the wires that pass through the handlebars. And then I'd say second is the engine, because those are areas where there's movement, vibration. When you have wires that don't move, you know, such as ones, you know, going near the voltage regulator, all that kind of stuff, those never have problems. So it doesn't really matter which way you want to route the wiring. I tend to like to go from the left side. It's going to be a little bit easier. And see, I'm turning this, and typically you could just feed this down. Sometimes you may need to have a stiff wire. But I just want to get it down to the junction box. And this is all I need to do. And if you were doing the handlebar switch, you pretty much got another step on it. So I'm feeding the wire down, and eventually we'll pop right out down here. So with the left side, you can sometimes reach through this little hole here, pull the wire through, and stay on the left side and continue to feed the wire down towards the junction box. You don't want to go out of this hole because it allows for some movement. You know, of the wiring when you steer the scooters. There we go. So there's the wire. Pop through. You see it's no problems there. Go ahead and you can either leave the tubing with it. I have a length of tubing about that long there. And I'll leave the wire about this long. You can always cut more off. You don't want to cut too short to begin with. So we'll go ahead and feed the tubing down the wire. And this tubing may be hard to source locally. I buy it from automotive electrical supply wholesaler. So I buy it in bulk and have quite a bit of it. And then once you get it on the wire, then you're able to pull the tubing through. So And you're fine with the rest, you know, with most of the wire just being the green wire up here. So there's our green wire, and it's going to go to the ignition switch. So I'm going to go ahead and strip the end of the green wire. This will go to the ignition switch. And if you're still running an old P200 with this original green wire, I can't believe it still works. That's all I could say, if it still is working. So most likely it's been replaced at this time. But you're probably, if you're doing this at home, you're probably fixing up an old barn find P200, or maybe you're restoring one and you want to use the original harness. I got a fancy crimper here, and it does a professional style terminal. You may just have the standard style crimpers. Those work good enough for this kind of application. I'm going to put a little bit of heat shrink tubing over that terminal, and you just take a small flame and just carefully heat that up, or you use a heat gun. And there you go. A nice terminal right there. We'll go ahead and put the new ignition switch in. On the front side, it's just got a knurled nut. You just carefully unthread that. Then you push the ignition right out. So we'll take the new one, go ahead and install that. So you got the new switch. Kind of similar arrangement. It does have an extra washer that you may or may not use. This flat goes up towards the top. So drop that in place. And go ahead and flip this over. And it looks like there's already a washer there. I almost like the washer that's on there because it's kind of stuck, you know, with the scooter and this little bezel that's usually missing, because oftentimes people have replaced this handlebar cover and that's no longer there. So just go ahead and tighten it about as tight as you can do it by hand. On and off. So we're all good there. Now we can remake the connections, the larger terminals. And see how that was very loose? No problem. You just want to have a needle nose or some type of pliers. And sometimes these terminals are just a little worn out, or the new connector is not quite the same. So I'm just going to go in there and give it a little squeeze on both of them, so it tightens up the terminal. Very critical that you have all these terminals tight, and you might check all the other terminals before we button it up. We'll go ahead and do that. So go ahead and plug this in. Let's see how that fits. Oh, that's nice and tight. Let's see how this one is. That one's tight, no problems there. So a ground terminal, nice and tight. And then our new green ignition kill switch wire. So I'm going to route this in a way where it's not tangled up with other stuff under here. You know, it's kind of a little bit of a rat's nest in these old P200s, so I'm going to route it on this side. There's definitely a little more slack than I need, but that's fine. And we'll go ahead and plug that into this top one here. So pretty much that's the fix for the one wire that goes bad on these. You want to check these pair of grounds on the bottom of the speedometer. Very common that they're loose. This is your speedometer light, just to show you how that works. Obviously, once we get the battery in there, we'll be able to see the speedometer illuminate. That bulb looks really nice. It's not blackened. Looks like the original bulb. Same goes with the neutral light. It pulls right out. I'm not going to pull it out unless I need to. The neutral light connection. You got the indicators. Oftentimes these little bulbs go out, or the sockets get corroded and they no longer work. You can buy complete things. They look very nice. There's no corrosion on there. So I suspect these new ones are going to work fine. But we'll test all those. I'm not going to bolt the cover down just yet. Make sure the headlights work in. These are all very stiff. I'm going to take a high quality lubricant. This stuff's really, really good. It's hard to get. Worth HHS Plus. I mean, it's a really good lubricant for this kind of application. And you just want to put a little bit around here, let it soak in. Don't want to get too crazy because then it drips all down the paint job. But this stuff stays behind. If you use something like WD-40, it's not going to It may penetrate, but it's not going to last because it's just almost too liquidy. So all in these parts, if you really want to take it to the nth degree, you take this all apart, but I don't see any reason to really take this apart. This thing is stiff and kind of nasty, so. Oh, it's already getting better. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's just like, it feels like it just turns so much nicer now. And the more the oil works in there, you know, it never quite returns, I'll tell you that. They do have a return spring here, but they never quite, you know, once you get the carburetor hooked up, it may do a little bit of that. But the steering bearings, I don't see any issue there. May pull the speedometer cable out. That just pulls out like such. And it's very dry, so we'll put a coat of grease on this. All stuff you do while you're in here, you know, it's like this thing's really dry. Only takes a small amount of grease, you know, to lubricate the cable. You don't want to get too heavy with it. Might put too much resistance on the cable. Just a real light coat of grease. I mean, you could even spray something like that. Worth spray on there, it would be fine. And say you can't get it through. The key to getting the cable through, say if you're having difficulty there, you go down and reach on the housing like you did when we, you just got to change the position of the housing, and then you can usually feed the inner cable back through. See how it went right through? Just by me changing the housing position a little bit. And then it's making the bend, so you got to fight that a little bit. There we go. Now we're past all the hard spots. And then the last little bit, you may need to rotate the cable to get it to engage into the gear in the speedometer. So there it is. So cable's all lubed up. I may take the gear out from the speedometer drive once I get this going. I'll probably re-grease the fork bearings, and we'll grease up that speedometer drive as well. So for right now, I think I'm pretty much done for this. And all I'm going to do is just set this up here and just leave it, you know, without the screws, because we may need to do more troubleshooting with the electrical system. So we went ahead and removed the pair of screws from the rear of the tank, and then the front part of the tank, and then the last one that holds the front section of the seat. I'm holding onto the seat as I remove that screw, and just carefully lift the seat up. Last thing you want to do is drag this metal bracket right down your paint job, mess it up. I know this tank has been out before. There's some fuel in here, and when I do part 4, I'm going to go through the fuel system, and we'll deal with the fuel tank at that time when we get the scooter running. So you want to lift from the back and then move it towards the front. Gosh, that stench. You may need to remove the fuel lever. It's 2 Phillips screws that take this off. And the reason I am pulling this out is because I need to run the new green wire through the length of the frame. So go ahead and lift the tank, carefully lift it out. And you got both the oil line and this old crusty fuel line. Just carefully pull them right through the grommets. I'm holding the tank by the filler. Careful, because that metal is pretty sharp. Pull the oil line out as well. You may need to put some type of cap on the ends of these things. Like I have the screw for the junction box in there, which I will probably need soon. But we'll go ahead and get this out of the way. We'll set it aside for now. So the tank's out. You can see this is the wires that run to the original taillight. This runs to the battery and the voltage regulators. No problems here. And this is the wiring that goes for both the neutral switch and to the stator plate on the engine. So we're going to go ahead and lift up this diaphragm. Oftentimes this diaphragm is missing from older scooters. It's a good thing because it keeps the air filter pretty clean as well, because this area is like a cavity where the engine pulls its air from right underneath the seat, that hole that's right behind the seat. And you can carefully lift this out Sometimes they're pretty stubborn. Sometimes they'll end up breaking because they're just brittle and old. You see this one's soaked up some oil, but I'll probably have to fight with it a little bit to get it out. So get your fingers underneath it. It's pretty tight in there. This is a nice original one. Sometimes they fit a little sloppier there. So you can see it's got a slot for the wiring. It's collected a little bit of oil that's dripped out from the tank, which I'll just wipe off, and hopefully won't have an oil leak after we service the fuel system in the oil tank. Set that aside for now. And there's a little bit more wiring that you may be concerned with as well. These two springs here have ground wires on them. These are two connections for your turnstiles, both the left and right cowls. So what we're going to want to do is run a wire the whole entire length, the green wire that is, and it will exit at the engine. So we're going to go ahead and pull the brake pedal out. You may ask why, not because of the wiring problems, but we're going to run the green wire. And when you pull the brake pedal out on a P200, it gives you more access to the channel where all the control cables and wiring is routed. So there's a pair of nuts that hold the brake pedal in place. So on this inner one, originally they had a tab that locks over the nut on the inner one, just so the nut won't fall out. Don't want the brake pedal starting to come loose on you. Oftentimes that's missing. I never really see it too often. So I bent the little tab out, and I'll get that last screw or bolt out of the way here. And I'll show you what I was referring to. So there's a tab washer that bends over the screw, and that's what locked the nut. Now we got a loose brake pedal, and it's a little bit tricky. You may have to disconnect the brake cable from the engine, the back of the engine, to get this all the way out if there's no free play. But unfortunately, it's just a little bit of a trick getting these out. So I have the cable disconnected from the rear brake, and then you could carefully fish this whole unit out. And you can see there's a cable. It'd be a perfect time for us to lubricate this when we put it all back together. But now we have access to the cavity where we can route a new wire. So I have a brand new cable housing for a clutch or a brake or whatever. They happen to work really good is a wire fish. One thing about these frames, they're not exactly easy to fish new wires, and usually you want to use your old cables to fish the new wires through. But I want to fish one new wire, just one wire that's not included in the main harness, and I'm not going to go as far as pulling the whole harness out to do that. So I went ahead through the brake pedal access hole. I have the cable housing through, and you just got to reach around up in the hole. There's not much room, especially when you got a fork in place. Obviously if the fork's out, it's even easier. And you can kind of use your ear to listen to where the cable's, popping up through. But going from this direction is always the easiest direction to get a cable through. So, pretty much I feel the control cable up here, and you pull it right up. It's going to be on the wrong side right here, so sometimes you don't want to pull the wires on this side of the fork bearing, so I'll kind of push it back in and fish it just kind of right on the other side of the here, and I want it to come out on this side, so just with where the main wiring harness, and there we go. So I have a long length of the green wire here, and you could stick it in there, and the cool thing is this 18 gauge wire, it actually kind of sticks in there, so, and will stay. You could put tape on it, but as what I'm doing right now is I'm just going to use it as a fish and pull the wire through. So, kind of feed the wire as we're pulling the control cable through. It would be really difficult to try to fish this real floppy copper wire through, and that's why you want to use something stiff like a control cable. I mean, you could use a cable inner, you could use concrete, like tie wire. There's plenty of other stiff wires that work good. Go pull a bunch of this slack out, but not all of it. And then next I want to fish the green wire to the back of the frame. And ideally, you'd also do something like this. Say I'm building a custom, or I have a customer who just wants some auxiliary lights on the front. This is how I'd fish extra wires if I was doing some custom lighting on a scooter. So pretty much I fished the cable back through, and since I have the tank out of here, I can see the control cable right up in here. Obviously the camera doesn't get it. Maybe Scott will get the camera up in here. And I'm reaching to where the cable is up in this area. And of course, you know what? Whenever you fish a wire through, the cable always wants to go to the most inconvenient spot, like the corner. So, getting there. And magic. So there we go. So do the same, back towards the back of the frame. And voila, we got the green wire back here. So this green wire only goes to one place, and it's to the ignition CDI box. So I'm gonna go ahead and feed it through the grommet. The grommet's in great condition, this original grommet. You see the control cables and the other wires that go to the engine. It feeds right through, no problem. And so far I have no area where there's, I have any need to put some sheathing over the wire. So but right now we're okay with just the bare wire, and I'll leave a little slack. I'll get some sheathing so we can cover the rest of the wire. So this green wire is going to run to the same spot where this grommet terminates right here. So I only need about enough sheathing so it pops through right there. And go ahead, just the right size for one wire, feed that through. You always want to have more wire than you need because, there you go. So go ahead and pull that through. The cool thing about this wire is you just pull the sheathing and you pull the wire through as well. So, and it's about the same length there. Go ahead and cut the zip tie here because we're going to do a new zip tie. And probably better to use diagonal pliers to do that, but just happen to have a knife. So what we're going to do with this is the new wire is going to go right through here. Go ahead and pull that through. And it looks like it was meant to be. Just an extra black wire there, no big deal. And we'll pull the grommet back and we'll make that about the same length as this original terminal here. So go ahead and cut the crispy old green wire that's no longer needed out of this harness. And terminate right about there. Cut this wire right there. One thing you can do is you could reuse this little plastic thing. If you were using the small enough terminals that are just like the original one, which is we have the same exact terminals that they originally had, it would look like it was meant to be. So strip the wire. I have a little terminal. I have the fancier crimp tools for these flag style terminals. You use other types of ways to put a terminal on there. Go ahead and pull that over. And just like the original, it's perfect. Good enough. So now we'll go ahead and route this wiring all through this, this little clip right here. And there's also the spark plug wire. We'll put that there. And it all fits just fine right there. We're not worried about anything else. Carburetor is going to go back in at a later time. Now we're just concerned with getting all the wiring hooked back up. Pull the grommet up if I want here. And you have all the wire colors, they all match. Start with the purple. And again, just like up in the headset, make sure they're tight connections, because if they're loose, you're going to have, you know, you may have a charging problem or something like that. So you got the yellow, put the longer one to the short lead on the other side, and the last one right here. So each one of these connections, once you made the connections, they just go ahead and they just friction fit right into each one of these grooves. So you just tuck them right in there. No big deal, no order. Just doesn't really matter what order you do these in. So, and they'll tend to want to pop out sometimes. So you may need to fight them. You can use a little needle nose pliers or something like that to hold them. I usually tend to put the ground one on the inside, closest to that little screw. Tuck all these wires in. Could have trimmed that a little bit more. And see that green wire? I left that one slot down the middle for the green wire. And once all the wires are tucked in there, just close the lid and say goodbye. So you're done with that. And you know, sometimes it may pinch. And slide the grommet over this. Just kind of tighten it down, you know, just to hold it in place. You take the screw and go right through the cap and tighten it down. So not much to it. And then you have all these wires. This boot's in really nice shape. I'm going to reuse that, no problems there. So you can route all the wires right through the boot. This is a little tricky sometimes. It is possible to take the CDI box off if you want to make the job just a little easier, but usually there's enough room to pull the boot back to do this. So just like the sticker on there, Bianco, white, get Rosso, got the red. Make sure they're all the way down and tight. There's a lot of vibration in this area, and a lot of times you have an intermittent ignition problem. It's because these terminals don't fit tight. But they're all brand new terminals since I did new wiring. Not only is the wiring new, you know, when you do the rewire the stator, you're putting new terminals in the the highest quality kind of flag style terminals that crimp over the wire. So once they're all tight connections, all you got to do is slide the boot over the CDI box, and you're done right there. So this little guy goes in this clip right here, and we could put that single zip tie back in place. Tighten my last screws. Kick the engine over without a spark plug in there. Make sure the fan's not rubbing on the shroud. But that's pretty much all the wiring that there is at the engine. Last but not least, there still is a neutral light switch, and these two connections, remarkably, they're still intact. Oftentimes you'll see an old P. These things are not intact. This boot's kind of not in the best condition, but it's still usable, and there isn't really the exact same boot. So I'd rather use that little boot. So what I'm going to do is get some zip ties and tidy some stuff up. So put a zip tie around the remains of this boot here, just to kind of hold it to the switch. And that should keep it in place for a while, no problems there. And also with this wiring, they had a zip tie originally right around here. You don't want to go around the spark plug wire, you can keep that separate. Doesn't need to be as big as zip ties they originally had, it's just there to keep things bundled up. And if you wanted more zip ties, you certainly could. You know, put another zip tie. You can see the wiring kind of goes in front of the spark plug there. You don't want it drooping down too low, but I'm just going a little overboard. They never did this originally, but kind of keep everything nice and bundled up. So in the front, we're going to make the one wire junction, the pair of wires that originally went through the original wiring harness. We're going to make the new connection. So you take the pair of green wires, the one leading up to the handlebar cover and the one leading to the engine, the stator that was just hooked up in the last step. Go ahead and strip those two, and you need to have the right kind of terminal that can accept two wires. I have one right there. And we'll get that lined up and carefully. Sometimes it's a little tight to get two in there. You need to set this up a little differently. and kind of get this all set, jigged up so it will work. And there you go. Just crimp both of them. You can see how the flag terminal kind of crimps down on the insulation. You may not have a crimp tool like this, but it is pretty key to do some thin crimps for these connections. We'll go and connect it up to the kill switch wire that's up in the handlebars. Those are the horn and the high beam wires. The turn signal wires is the blue and the brown. This white one is the power to the turn signals, and then there's also a ground wire. So just like the junction box on the back of the engine, the wires go into slots and it's secured with just a couple plastic tabs. And I want to show you, sometimes these tabs don't fit very well. You can wedge something like a piece of wire or something in there, because the last thing, you don't want that coming open and the wires end up shorting each other. So sometimes I'll just put 2 little scraps of wire in there, and that will keep those from coming open. They're in there pretty tight. They have some friction to them. So get the spare tire out. You could also get the shield out. Don't need to show how to remove those. This is your battery tray, and this has got the original screws. They're just these very flat screws that are pretty rare. You can't really buy these kind of screws. And then they have a star washer behind them. Kind of like them. They're kind of cool looking screws. Battery tray is in the original gray. Later battery trays were in black. Somebody didn't have the acid tube at one point. You see it corroded the tray just ever so slightly on the right side there where the tube exits. And oftentimes I'll take the third screw, I'll just loosen up, and I'll leave the tray in place. So at this point, you could just turn the whole thing, and you have access to everything. There's the original voltage regulator. I showed you the replacement regulator. We're going to go ahead and check the fuse holder. Be very careful if you do have an original fuse holder. Please don't break it. This clip is not easily obtainable. I'm going to actually pull the terminal off and then get it out of this thing, because normally it just snapped right out of this clip, but the thing is old and brittle plastic, the clip that is. Fuse holders are usually okay unless they're corroded, so we're going to check this out. The way these original fuse holders worked, you just go ahead and twist that, and there's the original style fuse in there. Little corrosion on there. You know what I'm going to do? The terminals are in really nice shape. I'm just going to put a new fuse in there, 8 amp fuse. Hopefully, cross my fingers there's no shorts, so, and I don't have to do further troubleshooting. I don't suspect any shorts. Everything looked really good in the handlebar cover. That's oftentimes where there may be a short. So that threads together. The yellow fuse holder, you could put one of those on if you needed to. Another thing you could do, you could tape the fuse holder, put in a little bag, zip tie it there. If you ever want an extra fuse, have it right next to where the fuse holder is. Regulator looks fine. We're just gonna, I won't be able to test that until I get the scooter started. I'm gonna leave, now, I'm gonna change this because I just know these things don't work. Every time you have these original ones, just start with a brand new fresh one. So the rubber thing, you could pop that out. It's a pretty cool one, but nice original one. I'll put it in the glove box. Just I don't know, whoever ends up with the scooter might dig the idea that it still has some original parts with it. But kind of like people that restore tube radios, they want to make them original with the tubes, but they'll hide the brand new capacitors underneath, the modern electronics that are much more reliable. So there's the flasher, pretty much the same shape. There's a couple different terminals on the bottom. You have L for light, so that goes to the light switch. That's what that. You have P for pilot. That's for the little indicator on the dash. These terminals are very tight, so P for pilot. Let's go ahead and put that on there. And the last one is, I think, called the X terminal. Not sure what that means, but it's the one that goes to the switch power from your ignition switch. So there you go. Get those in there. This rubber thing's in really, really nice shape. You can buy a new rubber suspender to hold the flasher. It definitely needs to be in a rubber surround. If they're just zip tied to the frame that vibrates with the engine frequency, the flashers tend not to work. So you just pull this right through the hole, and that's how you mount the flasher there. Two last things. It's a shame somebody trimmed the terminals. The original terminals on the 12N 5.53B batteries were a lot smaller, but all the replacements now use a larger screw. So unfortunately, these, somebody trimmed them already. They're not very useful. So we're gonna go ahead and put 2 new terminals on this. Wire still looks really good. It's about the right size. Yeah, the red, so the wire just pops through. This is more of a traditional style crimp terminal. And sometimes I'll also crimp it there, give it a tug. Always want to do the little test, because if it's not tight, you're going to end up with a bad electrical tree. That wire is really nice too. And pop that through. And you know what? For right now, I'm going to cross my fingers that the regulator works. Obviously, I'll test that once we get the scooter started in the next week's video, where I clean the carburetor, clean out the fuel tank, put a new fuel line, all that fun stuff. But for right now, we're going to get some basic tests in, see if all the DC electrical system works. So everything that runs off the battery, that includes your taillight, brake light, turn signals, the horn, and on these 78 and 78 models, also the light that backlights the speedometer runs off the battery. The later P200s, the 1980, 81, P125X, the speedometer light, backlight ran off the magneto, so it only illuminated when the scooter was running. They did have a brighter headlight system because they went to, they had a regulator for the headlight. So I got a brand new battery here, and I'll tell you, these battery straps, you'll swear that this thing is way too short, but it's the way they are. Look at that thing. But it's going to hold the battery in secure. The way I like to do it, if there's nothing in the way, you could just use a flat blade screwdriver and use the leverage of the screwdriver to get that in. So start with the positive terminal over here. Have brand new hardware with the battery. And I know this battery's like fully charged. Just came off the charger. It's all full of acid. So see how it's got the larger screws? Those original terminals don't really fit on these screws. That's why somebody cut them open. Or they're corroded. You're dealing with a really old scooter. It's had batteries that leaked acid onto the screws. So good to just start with new terminals at the battery. The wires are really bad. You may even just splice in new wires. So, and let's do the spark test. Let's see what happens. Ignition's off, no spark. If it made a big spark, I would suspect a short somewhere, maybe at the ignition switch. If the ignition switch is off, it probably would have blown the fuse, but no issues there. So the battery hose is very important because it prevents corrosion on your frame and also the battery tray. These lead acid batteries are not sealed, and they tend to, there's vapors from the battery that come off the battery that tend to leak. So is what I like to do is I'll put a brand new hose that's nice and tight on the battery terminal. There's a single hole back here, and I'll put a zip tie right around the hole, and you want to tighten it just enough to secure the hose. You don't want to tighten it so much that it crimps the hose, because if you pinch off the hose, well, you're gonna have problems, and the battery's gonna leak acid elsewhere, maybe out of the vents on the top or something. And it's not good. So cut our zip tie, just a little tail, maybe past wherever the spare tire is. So it's just a little vent. You don't want it dripping on your rear hub. and out of the way of the spare tire. So that's kind of the best way to route the vent tube for the battery. So this is my first test. Let's see, we're either gonna blow the fuse and have to do further troubleshooting, or lights are gonna work. Wow, I see a neutral light, which is a good thing. I see the tail light. I know it has the front brake switch, so you can see the backlight. The speedometer looks wonderful on this thing. And the neutral light's on. So far, we're looking good. Let's pull the brake. Oh, no problem. The front brake, unique to the American market scooters, they had a front brake. The brake pedal is dangling outside of the thing, but I'm gonna test it right now. Is it working? Yeah, there it is. If it was working intermittently, which it is doing sometimes, I'm gonna actually spray something really light on that brake switch, make sure it's working. See, sometimes I'm activating it and it doesn't come on. So I may spray a little bit of WD-40 on it just to make sure it's nice and reliable. And it's getting better just with use. A lot of times with switches, when you start using the switch, it cleans the terminals, and that's what fixes the problem. So let's try our right turn signal. Wow, that's amazing. They're working fine. The little indicator on the dash is working perfect, and it alternates whenever the turn signal's on. So the little indicator's working there. This bike is actually turned out to be a little too easy for me. Here's something you do want to check if you're having problems. See that little brass pad right there? That's the contact, the ground contact. You may need to sand that if your turn signals aren't working. So I'm running the left turn signals. I'm going to put the cowl on. There's no harm in doing this while the turn signals are operating. And you get the little peg into the thing right there. And look at that. Working perfect. Sometimes give them a tap if they go in and out. You're going to want to check the grounds. And the way these turn signals ground to the cowl, they just have a star washer behind one of the nuts. You may need to just tighten the nuts on all the turn signals so the star washer bites in through the paint into the frame. And that's how those turn signals ground. So that's a little too easy for me. Everything's working. So all the DC systems work. Let's test the last one, the horn. There's a chance the horn just won't work and we could tinker with it. It's the beauty of this nice original bike. Sometimes you try to troubleshoot stuff and it's like a can of worms. So let's see what happens. Sounds perfect. Sounds exactly like it did back when the scooter was new. If the horn wasn't working, this is the adjustment screw. I'm not going to even mess with it. It changes the tone of the screw or the horn. And oftentimes you'll just turn it a little bit and sometimes you get the horn contact to work. No problems there. So we're going to go ahead and turn this off. And so far, that's pretty remarkable. 100% success on the DC electrical system. The last ones we do want to check. I know the neutral light's coming on, so I know if I shift out of neutral, the light will extinguish, which is a very handy feature, only found on the American market scooters. We're going to get the motor running. I'll be able to test the high beam and low beam, see if the little high beam idiot light comes on. Make sure the battery charging voltage is correct and within specifications. And that will pretty much sum up everything I need to do to have this scooter electrically sound. In the next video, part 4, I'm going to go through the carburetor, replace the fuel lines, clean out the tank, and hopefully have the scooter running and ride around. And part 5, I'm going to do a lot of the little odds and ends, like re-grease the front brake. I know the brake is the grease is just really hard in there. I'm going to leave all this stuff partly apart because it helps with troubleshooting. The last thing you want to do is take things back apart. Until I know every system is working good on the scooter, I'm not going to finalize it. So I hope everybody found that pretty useful, whether you're just getting into vintage bikes or you're pretty seasoned. Hopefully some of my techniques like soldering up a stator plate helped you out. Look out for the next video next week. Till next time, this is Robot from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com here in San Diego, California. Check us out on the web, ScooterWest.com. Follow us on Instagram, Vespa Motorsport. Follow me, Robot Vespa. Subscribe to our channel, helps us out. Over 60,000 subscribers as of the very end of 2019. I'm going for that 100,000. I don't think any other Vespa channel is up that high. Robot here. See you next time.